Hey, and I'm back, this time actually within the kind of week time limit that I was hoping to try to hit with these. And we're going to be finishing out the fins for the rocket model that we started last time. So last video, if you haven't seen it, we built this fuselage in Houdini. It's procedural, basically just a curve and some things to like cut it up and then bevel the cut edges to make these panel lines, make it look all nice and smooth. And again, procedural, which is nice. Now we're going to make some procedural fins. This will hopefully be a little bit shorter. Last time we went way over, it was like 40 something minutes, but this time hopefully we can keep this a little bit shorter. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to drop down a grid first and just hit enter. And I'm going to go ahead and make that visible. We'll leave the rocket fuselage here templated so we can kind of see it in scale here. Now with our grid selected, I'm going to make this 1 unit each, and we don't need all these divisions here. I'm just going to make this 2 by 2. And if you want to know how I'm jumping from box to box here, I'm just hitting tab. So tab jumps from box to box, shift tab will jump back, and that works the same both Mac and PC, and not just in Houdini. That's kind of a universal thing, is tabbing from box to box. So now with the mouse over here in the viewport, I'm going to hold spacebar and hit H and Alt and right click and drag to kind of zoom in and see what we're doing with this grid. So what we're going to be doing actually is sweeping the grid along a curve. We'll make the grid first and then we'll define the curve that we're going to sweep along. So there's our grid. I want this to be kind of upright, so I'm going to put this in X, Y. Making sure this orientation is correct is pretty important, because otherwise you'll end up with some weird stuff going on when you sweep it. It'll twist and do some really weird things. So you make sure that these are kind of oriented properly. So that's in the XY plane. And I'm going to go ahead and just divide this up so I can see the perspective and also see kind of a side view or a front view at the same time. So right now, just by default, I ended up in the right view. You want to check what you're looking at here. You can change. You can by holding spacebar and pressing 2 so we can get to the top, or 3. So now we're in the front. And we actually do want to be in the right view. So spacebar 4 will get you to the right view. You can be in the left view too, but I would recommend being in the right view. And we're going to be drawing our curve in this window over here to make sure that it doesn't kind of move around in 3D space. We just want the curve to kind of exist in in 2D space, not in 3D, because again, it'll make some weird issues with our fin kind of like bending and doing weird stuff. All right, so let's add a curve. So we'll tab with your mouse over there and take the curve, drop that down. And I'm going to change this to NURBS right off the bat, just like we did with the rocket before. I'm going to change it to NURBS so we can get a nice smooth curve without having to do too much in terms of moving points around. And with my mouse over here, I'm going to hit enter to make sure I'm in the drawing kind of workspace. And if it doesn't work, you might have to hit escape and then hit enter again if it doesn't work straight away the first time. There we go. So click and click again and click again. And click again. So something about like that. We can always go in and change these points, and just like we do with the rocket, you can add more points if you want to. I'm just going to hit enter to finalize this. And we can also move these points around too, but it's probably better to wait until we see what the fin actually looks like before you spend too much time moving these around. All right, so there's our setup. If I go back over here in the 3D viewport, you can see kind of how this is going to work. I've got this grid and it's placed so that it's going to be sweeping along. It's kind of making a bunch of copies of that grid along this curve. We can go ahead and do that just to see what it looks like. So I'm going to drop a sweep node down. And a quick shortcut to attach these together instead of having to wire everything manually. If you just select everything and then drag it to the first input, it'll just automatically assume that whatever is on the right side is going to go into the second input, which is exactly what we want. We want our grid to go here in this cross section, and we want the spine to go in the backbone. So the cross section follows the backbone. I'm going to make this visible so we can see what it's doing. You can see how it's kind of just making copies of that grid at each point. So we made 4 points. It makes 4 copies of the grid, 1 at each point. Pretty straightforward. Let's sweep. We've got some extra options like angle fix, which you'll probably want to have. That just kind of makes sure that it doesn't squish the grid in a weird way. And then fix flipping, you can turn that on. That's not helping us here. And then also on output, we can actually turn this into a 3D thing instead of just copies of the grid. So I'm going to do skin with auto closure. And you can start to see how this thing is going to take shape here. So let's get a little bit closer in here. So next, what we need to do is we need to control kind of the taper of this, and we need to control the size, and we need to add some more points first, because this just isn't great detail. It's looking pretty blocky. So I'm going to go ahead and add a resample. Resample lets us just control how many points we get, and also turns it into a polygon. So now we've got tons of points here. I'm going to change this for maximum segment length, this checkbox. I'm going to uncheck that and then do maximum segments. And that makes it easier to kind of control how many points you actually get. So we can increase lots of resolution or decrease for less resolution. Maximum segment length is just going to be the space between those, which kind of depends on the curve, and it's a little bit, it's not going to give you exact control over how many points you get. Another really important thing that we need to do while we're here is we need to check this little box for the curve view attribute. If you mouse over curve view, it kind of gives you a very vague description of what this is. But essentially, curve view creates an attribute that stores like the size and all sorts of other data for each point along this curve. And it does it in a 0 to 1 kind of space. So starting at the beginning and then going towards the end, it's going to create this. And we need that because we're going to be, and I'm sorry, but we're going to be scripting just a little bit of stuff here. Just a tiny bit of X. It's not going to be super crazy. So I'm holding Shift. I'm just going to drag that up here. We're going to add a wrangle. So an attribute wrangle. So I just type in wrangle, so W-R-A, and then attribute wrangle pops up. And this by default is going to be along points, which is exactly what we want to do. So we're going to be using this wrangle to kind of control the shape of the fin. We're going to use that to kind of taper it and make it smaller as it goes along towards the bottom. We're also going to use that to control like the height and width and all the main kind of basic attributes. Let's go ahead and change this to a single view because we don't need that 2D view anymore. All right, so let's jump into our attribute wrangle. If you've never done any kind of scripting before, just kind of follow along. This is, I know, going to get a little bit, just a tiny bit complex. We're not going to do anything crazy, though. We're just going to store a couple of variables, and we're going to apply them. Nothing super difficult. Houdini, as a general rule at this point in 2019, is kind of moving away from some of the other, there's like 3 languages. There's Python, and there's the Houdini or HScript, and then there's Vex. And it's kind of moving away from HScript to Vex. Now, Python is going to continue, I'm sure, forever, but Vex is kind of taking over everything else. And the reason is that it's much faster because it's multi-threaded. So if you have like a 24-core computer like I do, then you can actually use those cores, whereas HScript, I believe, is only single-threaded. But suffice it to say, use Vex as much as possible and really just get used to using Vex if you're planning to use Houdini in the future. So we need to store some variables, we need to make some controllers, and we need to apply those controllers to a scale attribute. The way that we apply variables in Vex is to use the @ symbol. Now there are a bunch of things that are already kind of predefined, like position is @p, make sure that caps lock is turned off, and color is capital C, lowercase d. There's an excellent kind of resource on Houdini's site and also in the help files up here if you want to find out about all the different Vex attributes that you can use and kind of how to use those. But for right now, I'm going to be defining my own, one that doesn't actually exist right now. Basically setting up my own, so I'm going to call this width. And we're going to set that to equal, so space equals @width space equals, and then we're going to set that to be a channel. So what the channel will do is create a little slider for us to use to actually control this value. So we're going to do ch, and then in parentheses, quotes, we're going to call this width, and then end our quotes, end our parentheses. And very important, with any programming language like this, you need to make sure to end this with a semicolon, because the semicolon tells it, hey, I'm done with this, now you can move on to the next thing. Otherwise, it's just going to assume that everything that comes after that is all part of the same line. All right, so we're going to also do the same thing. We're going to do an @height equals ch, and then again, parentheses, quotes. This time we'll put height. And I'm just going to click out of this. It's not going to do anything yet, but if I click this little button right here, you'll see it creates these little sliders for us. So that's what we're going to use to control this. And just for now, I'm going to go ahead and set these both to 1 so that it doesn't make it 0. Otherwise, if it defaults to 0, our model is going to disappear later. All right. Next, we need to set a scale attribute for this thing. Or actually, we also need to set up our tapers. Before I forget, let's go ahead and set up our taper. So I'm going to do @taper. And this is going to use that curve view attribute that we output from the resample, and it's going to allow us to control it with a ramp so that we get some kind of fine control over this. So we're going to do ch ramp, and then parentheses, quotes, we'll call this taper. So that's going to be the attribute that it creates. And just a real quick note here, this is the variable that we're going to be storing and applying in Vex. This thing here is the type of parameter that we're creating. A parameter is something that you add to an interface like this. Then this here in the green is just the name of the parameter that we're creating, and then after that. So in some cases, depending on the parameter that you're creating, it's going to look for multiple values. With the channel, we just needed one thing. We needed a name for the channel. It's just going to create this slider. But with a ramp, we also need to tell it what we're going to be controlling with this. We've got the name, but we need to link it to something. So I'm going to put comma, and this is where I'm going to drop in that @curve view attribute that we output before. So it's going to control the curve view using that taper. So I'm just going to hit this little button again so it'll actually create that ramp. Again, it's not going to do anything for us yet because we haven't actually applied this. Now to apply this, we're going to use scale. The reason I'm doing it this way is that I want to be able to kind of change the scale in each dimension separately. I don't want to just scale the entire thing down because it creates weird geometry, and what looks fine up here at the top, once you squish that all down into like a little tiny point down here at the bottom, doesn't work very well, and it creates this really messy geometry. So we want to have a little bit more control over this. So for this particular attribute, this is what's called a vector. Vector attribute stores 3 values. Scale has x, y, and z scale, and so this is a vector. And to do this properly, we put v at the beginning to define it as just a regular vector with 3 values. There are different types of vectors. Vector 2, vector 4 is store more values. In this case, though, we're just going to use regular vector. So v, and we're going to do @scale. So scale, you can see it pops this little thing up here. That's telling us that this is something that's already, it's an attribute that already exists. Like when I typed in width, it didn't pop anything up for me. But when we type in scale, that already exists. There's something that's already defined within Vex. So v @scale. Now for this to work, we need to say set. So we're telling it here, make sure that you have set before you put in your parentheses. Now inside of our parentheses, we can go ahead and just put 1, 1, 1. We can kind of look, I'm going to mess with this a little bit, and we can kind of see how this is going to change. So right now our scale is being applied as 1, 1, 1. Nothing has really changed. So if I go in here, so this is x, y, z. So x is the first one, y is the middle one, and I set y to 2. Now y is going to be twice as tall. And if I go and set 1, or set x to like 0.1, we can see how this is going to start to make our fin, right? Now this is where we can start to pass in some other information. If we just use the straight up the curve view that we had from before, without doing the actual taper where it's being controlled by the ramp, we just pass it straight into here without using taper. You can see how it's kind of changing this. Now it's got it reversed, which is not great. Now we could go up into the curve and then hit reverse here so it reverses it properly. Or we could just use our ramp to do that, since we're going to be using ramp anyway. So instead of using curve view, I'm going to use @taper, that attribute that I created from before. And for our width, instead of using 0.1, I'm going to use that @width. So we'll click out here. All right, and so now we can kind of see what this is doing. And I can see here, actually, if I just reverse this and make the beginning really chunky, we can see how we get to control this really nicely. And I can use this width control. See how this is now letting us very quickly, very easily control this whole thing. Now, the taper is still linear. It's not giving us a whole lot of control, but what we can do is click on these little points here. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. If I click this first point and I set that to like Bezier, and then with the second point, also set that to Bezier. Now we can add additional points here. We get this nice curve, so we can kind of see how this, rather than just curving kind of depending on where it is in space, we can curve and get these really nice, like elegant curves here. One final problem we need to solve, though, is that we've got like this really tiny little bit down here. Now we could control that with this, but that gets a little bit funky, and I like to have just kind of one constant. And that's where our height is going to come in. So what I'm going to do is do @taper plus @height. So that's going to kind of activate this guy here. So our height here, basically we're taking that value from this slider and then we're just adding it to whatever we've got. So we can take this slider and we can just bring this up. If I want to make it, have a base that's a little bit chunkier, a little bit beefier, I can quickly do that. So that's pretty easy. Not too much scripting. The scripting is done, or well, yeah, the scripting is done. One last quick thing though is that we can click on this point. Like if that's not quite big enough for you, rather than jumping into the grid and doing it there, what we could do is actually just either use this height or use this, we could actually make this just a little bit bigger rather than changing the entire thing. We can make this point right here this value. So make sure that you're selected, that point is selected, and then just middle mouse click and drag, and we can kind of bring that up and make it a little bit larger. So it's going to be off the graph at that point, but that's okay. You can see a bigger ramp, but it's still kind of off the charts there, so to speak. So the control is there. Just keep in mind that we can't see it straight away. All right, so now we're done with that part. Let's go ahead and start to control the width and get a little bit more kind of fine-tuning control down here. So with this grid, let's go ahead and jump back in here. I'm going to template our nodes here. So one thing that I want to do is I want to be able to make maybe the top a little bit wider than the bottom. So just like an airplane wing, it might be a little bit wider at the top than it is at the bottom. So to do that, I'm going to do group. And my group is already set up to take the name of whatever the node is. So right now I have this $ capital OS. This is an old H script, by the way. And basically what that's going to do is whatever I name the node, it's just going to pull that in for the group name. So it just kind of simplifies things rather than having to have two names, one for the group and one for the node. I just name the node and then the group brings that in. So we call this the top points. And I'm just being a little bit short with that. This is going to group points, not primitives. So make sure that you're grouping points, not primitives. And then for the base group, I'm just going to do @p. So this a little bit more vex, just a tiny bit more vex. We're going to put in @p dot y, so that's the vertical, this little green arrow right here, @p dot y is greater than 0. So if the position is greater than 0, which in this case 2 of our 4 points are above 0 in the y-axis, so these 2 right here, it's going to group those. I'm just going to put those into a little points group called top points. And I'm going to open my groups. So here at the display group and attribute list, make sure we're looking at points here. We can see where it's created that top point. So if I just mouse over that, you can see where it's highlighting those points right there. So we're going to do the same thing with the bottom points. To make this a little bit faster though, I'm just going to hold Alt and click and drag and wiggle it until it drops in there. We're going to name this one bottom points. And this time, instead of being greater than 0, we're just going to do less than 0. It's pretty straightforward. So now, if I visualize this sweep, you can see it's actually taking those groups and it's grouped them all together. So all of our bottom points and all of our top points have come along for the ride. So let's go ahead and do something with those. In order to work with them, I can add a transform. And let's go ahead and grab our transform right here. So now, if you look at this, the top points you'll notice are actually on the bottom now, and the bottom points are actually on the top. So just keep that in mind as you're working with this. I want to make sure that the top is maybe a little bit bigger. So in this case, I'm going to select the bottom point since I've gotten flipped. And then we can scale these. So scale in the x-axis, we can make them a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to make it just a little bit bigger so we have this kind of nice taper so we can see what's going on with this thing. Looks pretty nice, pretty nice. And I guess if you wanted to control this even more with Vex, in terms of the X scale, you could absolutely use the curve view and another ramp and all that stuff. But since we've already done that, I'm going to keep this a little bit simpler here. So there's our transform. I want to also add a bit of extrusion to this. I want it to extrude, but we also need to cap this off. We've kind of created these big empty holes here, so I'm going to add a polyfill. Just drop that right down there, so that'll fill in those holes. We're still templating, that's where we see those extra lines there. All right, now to create the poly extrude, we need to do a couple of things. First, from the polyfill, I'm going to go ahead and output a patch group. So just like we can output attributes, we can also create groups. So with this polyfill activated, if I switch this over to primitives, we can see where it's actually created a group of the geometry that it made. So when it made those polygons, it said, hey, I'll put those in a group for you. So now we have a group called patch. Now, to get our groups from our points here, so we've got these nice point groups, but in order to extrude this, we want to turn these into primitive groups instead of the points. The way we do that is with a group promote. So I'm going to add a group promote. I'm just going to type in PRO, mo, and then we got group promote right here's the second one. And then just drop this down. And we want to do two promotions. We want to do one for the bottom points and one for the top points. So I'm going to click the little plus sign here. First thing here is going to do bottom points. So we're going to actually, since we know that the bottom points are on the top now, we're going to call those the top prims. And make sure that this goes from auto to primitives. It's on our little gear here. I'm going to change that to primitives here so we can see what it's creating. Now it's getting a whole bunch of stuff with this top rim, so the color is slightly different from that patch. But what we want to do is actually just click this little box so that we only get the stuff that's actually included. If you want to keep the points group from before, you can do that too, so you can do the little checkbox there. So on this one, we're going to do the same thing, primitives, except instead of bottom points, this time we're going to do the top points, and now we're going to call it the bottom prims. And check these same two boxes just like we had before. So now we've got the bottom prims, or the bottom prims, because that's what I typed in, and the patch and the top prim. So we've got all those groups together. And why are we doing all this? Well, we want to smooth this out. We want to get a little bit more detail with our subdivide, but when we add just the subdivide, it's going to look a little bit weird. So we want to have enough control to tell it, how much we want to round this out. Now you can get fancy with this and do multiple extrudes, like a different one for each group. I'm just going to keep this pretty simple. Just do one extrude. So I'm going to add a poly extrude. Drop this down here. And with the poly extrude, I can select all the groups I want to extrude. So with the drop down, I say I want to do the bottom prims. I don't want to select here. Let's escape. Accidentally click that little white arrow, so I'm selecting whites. I want to do the bottom prims, I want to do the patch, and I want to do the top prims. We're just going to extrude them all together. This is where Houdini's super powerful. We can actually, make that selection, and no matter what we add to it, like if I go back up here into a resample and increase the amount of detail, it's not going to mess things up. Like that would totally screw things up if you're working in Maya and Houdini, not a problem. And we can also kind of control the width of this stuff. If we want to do like a little inset, we can make it a little bit smaller. You do have to be a little bit careful. You don't want to make it too inset because it will kind of go over itself. So that's something you want to be aware of. Don't kind of squish it down too much, but we can kind of push it out. Now this is going inverted, and the reason is that our faces are inverted. If you want to fix that, you can put a reverse node before it in the stream. So now we put the reverse there. So now instead of going negative on the poly extrude, we can go positive. Makes a little bit more sense. And now everything's facing the correct direction, which is good. And that actually would pretty much create our low-res mesh. Like we could have just output our low-res mesh from here. But we're going to do the subdivide. And with the subdivide, you can see how it kind of smooths everything out for us, which is nice, but also can make the geometry a little bit weird. So we can do subdivide, we can increase the number of divisions, so we can get really, really smooth there if we want. And then we have the ability to go all the way back up here, mess with our transform and kind of adjust how wide that top is versus the bottom. We can go back up into our attribute wrangle here and adjust the width, so we can make it a little bit skinnier if we want. We can even go back and adjust the initial point. We can go in, actually here, let's adjust our height just a little bit so we can kind of make it a little bit squishier. And there's just lots of different things we can do to control this, and it's all completely procedural. So to finalize this, just before the subdivide, I'm going to add a clip there. The clip, we want to make sure is going the right direction. Right now it's facing the wrong way, so we're going to do 0 for x, and we want to make sure this is going in the positive z-axis. It's clipped off the stuff that we want to keep, though, so we're going to do primitives below the plane. There we go. And that's our fin. We need to add a color for our ID. Now we could add a color node like we did before, or now that we're using Vex, we can just come up here and add at capital C, lowercase d, equals, and this is going to be another thing where we set, because this is a vector set, and then in parentheses we could do like 0, 1 for red, 0 for green, and 0 for blue. And now everything's nice and red, so there's our ID. So you could do that in Vex, or you could just add a color node, but we're doing Vex, may as well be fancy and go all the way. So that's our fin. In the next video, we will go through placing this fin procedurally on the side of the rocket, and then we'll continue kind of building the rest of this this thing out and taking it into Substance Painter. So thanks for watching. I hope you find this helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe and click the little notification bell also so that you know when the next video comes out, which should hopefully be within maybe a week or maybe a little bit more, since I'm relocating again, doing my annual commute back to the other side of the world. So once I get set up and running again and all that good stuff, I will put up the next video. And I hope to see you there. Bye.